guess why don't we get started? Any questions so far? One notification, I sent it out on an email. Hopefully you guys got it, but the lab, the data is now up for the physical data of Dillman Hill. It's going to be due next Friday, so you give you guys the week. All right? Just the physical component out of it. The nutrient analysis and stuff like that, we're not going to be doing that for a while. Okay? Just the physical part. Okay? Cool. Let's keep going with organic matter. This is not the slide that I ended with. But this is the last topic that we were talking about. We were basically talking about the factors that are controlling organic matter decay. And we really we're talking mostly about placement. And then we were just at that issue right at the cusp of talking about size and area. Okay? And so what we're going to do today is basically talk about these three. Okay, so size and area. This is a really quick and short one, but it totally makes sense if you think about it. Okay, if we look at the particles, the size of the material that's being decomposed, larger particles have less surface area per volume. Does that make sense? Kind of like when we start cutting up the soil, the finer the texture, the more surface area you have for the volume. Okay, well, if that's the case, the smaller the particle is, the more surface area there is for the organisms that are going to be doing the decomposition to actually access that particle. Makes sense? Okay, so in reality, the reality is that surface area does in fact control decomposition rates. Smaller things decompose faster than larger things in general. Okay, now you have to take into account placement, CN ratio, and the nature of the recalcitrance of the material as well. But if you just look at size, smaller is faster than bigger when it comes to decomposition. Okay? All right. The next thing is, this is sort of the third controlling factor, and this is carbon-nitrogen ratios, CN ratios. Okay? A CN ratio is basically how much carbon there is relative to nitrogen. The larger the number, the more carbon there is to nitrogen. Okay? The smaller the number, the less carbon there is to nitrogen. Okay? There's intense, you got to sort of think about the nutrients in the system. We haven't really talked about this yet, but if you start thinking about nutrients, there are some nutrients that we need more of than others, right? I mean, if you think about sort of biomasses, we always sort of give this really simple equation, you know, of what organic matter is, and it's like CH2O, or sometimes it's 6, 12, 6. But we always sort of talk about these nutrients, but we don't talk about the other macro and micronutrients. But if you're thinking about decomposition rates, you really have to start thinking about what's here as well as all these other things. Because when we're eating stuff, we're eating things for two reasons. One is we're eating it for energy. But the second reason that we're eating this stuff is we're eating it for nutrients. Okay? Certain types of material have better nutrient quality than others. Okay? So you can certainly imagine that the nature of this ratio of carbon to nitrogen, okay, will certainly affect how readily this material is going to be acted upon, how readily it's going to be targeted to be eaten. And there is intense competition for these other nutrients. So the CN ratio is a good example. It could certainly easily be carbon-phosphorus ratios or carbon-potassium ratios. But nitrogen happens to be a very good example of what all these other nutrients are doing. And the ratio between carbon and nitrogen is a good reflection of how readily this material, the food material, is packed with nutrients. Make sense? Okay. There is intense competition for these nutrients. Okay. You've heard of woody type of materials and things like that. Actually, let me go to that slide right now. Okay. These are the typical CN ratios of a lot of different types of materials. Okay? Tree leaves, tree roots, wood, oak, bacteria, as well as grass shoots. So the CN ratios of these, basically, if I have a wood or an oak material, I've got 130 to 400 carbons per 1 nitrogen. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, look at the bacterial number here. The ratio of the biomass of a bacteria is 5 to 14 to 1. So that basically says to you, hey, just from a biomass perspective, just from an organism's perspective, this organism has to have so much more nitrogen compared to its feedstock than carbon. Does that make sense? And so as a result, the nitrogen is really in demand because it needs to have a lot of that. Okay? Now, another thing that we often don't think about when we think about decomposition, and this actually goes to a slide that we showed before. The slide looks, just show if I can find it quickly. This slide right here, this image right here. When we think of decomposition, we often think, and I just said it to you guys right now, when we eat, why do we eat? We eat for energy and for nutrients, right? But in that process of eating, there's a lot of byproducts. 60 to 80% of this material, this 100 grams of material that I'm eating, is being blown off as CO2. So I don't get to use it in my biomass. So when you start thinking about, when you start thinking about these types of CN ratios, you also have to think about what's the byproduct of here. Because they're not going to get 100% conversion of this material. Does that make sense? Okay, now, if they were getting, this is not possible, but if they were getting 100% conversion, the biomass, the CN ratio of the material that they want to eat would basically reflect their body. Does that make sense? Questions about that? Go. Okay. If there was no waste whatsoever, everything I ate got perfectly used by my body, which it does, I might add. Okay. But if I was a microbe, the perfect food for me would be, without any kind of waste, would be 5 to 14 to 1. Because I would be eating what reflected my body. Now, the problem with that is that I need two other things. Well, one I don't need and one I do need. One is I need to get energy too. Okay? And that energy is not reflected by this biomass. So right there, the carbon-nitrogen ratio of my food stock has to be larger than my body because I need to get energy too. And then on top of that, I'm respiring and I have CO2 waste, which tells me that my ratio has to be even higher than that. Does that make sense to everybody? Does that make sense? Okay. Good with this? So, let's go. What? Go.
How is biomass, what does biomass have to do with these ratios?
Well, different types of biomass, the food that you're eating, versus the biomass of the organism, have different CN ratios because, I mean, think about your body. My bone versus my muscle have very different CN ratios.
Like that they're composed of different CN ratios?
They're composed, the particle itself, my nails, my hair, my eyes, all of these materials in my body are made up of different combinations of the nutrients, right? So when I die, which we all will, when I die, I'm going to start decomposing. The organisms that are going to be decomposing me are going to have different types of feedstock associated with my body. Well, the same thing is going to go with all these other types of material. Okay, a tree is made up of a lot of different parts. It's got leaves, it's got roots, it's got bark, it's got cambium, it's got heartwood. All of those different components are going to have different types of CN ratios. Okay, does that make sense? Which means that they are going to have different combinations of C to N relative to this organism. Right? Okay, so let's write up here the things that the organisms are getting from decomposition. They're going to get nutrients. Okay, in the sense we can say this is they're building their bodies. This is biomass, right? Okay, they're also going to be getting energy. You know, ATP in essence. And the other thing they're going to do is they're going to be producing waste. Right? Okay, so waste certainly is going to be material that they didn't actually digest. So it's going to be waste food. Okay? So more organic matter, just in a different form. But they're also going to be waste in the issue of CO2. Right? Each one of these represents some of the material that's in that CN ratio. So if my biomass happens to be, let's make it simple, my biomass happens to be 10 to 1 CN ratio. Look at all the carbon and nitrogen I need to be able to get to that number. Right? Does that make sense? Kind of? Okay, let's take a look right here. Now, this is going to reflect two things. One is it's going to reflect the speed at which things get decomposed. And two is it's going to reflect, for lack of a better word, the selectivity of what's going to get decomposed. Okay, what is going to be targeted and how long is it going to take to decompose? Okay, so right here I've got three different, well actually two of them are cereal rye and one of them is a hairy vetch. Okay, they were killed at different times and they have different CN ratios. Okay, and what you're looking at here is the percent crop remaining. So as it goes down, it's being decomposed, and this is time. Okay, this is time from the kill, okay, or time from the addition. Okay, cereal rye, here's a 38 to 1 CN ratio versus hairy vetch, which is a 10 to 1 ratio. Which one gets decomposed faster? The 10 to 1. Well, why? It's more nutrients packed into it, and if my selectivity is there's a lot of competition for this, because look at this. Most of this material has really high CN ratios. Oops, wrong way. This has got a 10 to 1, this has got a 38 to 1, and so as a result, this stuff gets decomposed faster. Just its CN ratio. Go.
Is the CN ratio correlated to the degree of lignification?
Is the CN ratio correlated to what?
Degree of lignification.
Degree of lignification. No. Because I can't use my body in this case because we don't have a lot of lignin. But if you look at the plant tissue itself, in fact, lignin actually tends to have, the CN ratios tend to be lower. But having said that, many of these materials, lignin, as it decomposes, actually the CN ratio gets lower and lower and lower. Okay, so it's not necessarily a measure of, it's a measure of the material. Now, as it decomposes, this CN ratio will change, and that might be a better measurement of lignification. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. So we have these two different materials, high CN ratio, low CN ratio. The high CN ratio is a lot slower to decompose. And in fact, if you take the same material and you just kill it at different dates, the CN ratios change. So it's not necessarily the nature of the plant. This is a 38 to 1. This is a 28 to 1. The 28 to 1 is decomposing a lot faster than the 38 to 1. Okay, just the ratio. Okay, now that decomposition reflects this issue of what they're actually going to be using it for: biomass, energy, and these waste products. Okay, and that decomposition is going to be reflected in those CN ratios. Okay, now I need to stop here because I want to make sure everybody understands that this is just, CN ratio is just one of all four of these controls on decomposition. This just happens to be one. Size and surface area happens to be one. The reality is all of these are in combination. This one happens to be the most important. Okay, so let's keep going with CN ratio because I don't want you to. Now, it turns out, because of this issue over here, that the magic number, if you think about this, the magic number of carbon nitrogen for decomposition tends to be around 20. Okay, 20 to 1. Okay, now, what do I mean by that? When the CN ratio is greater than 20 to 1, i.e. I got a lot of carbon, very little nitrogen. Because of the organisms that are doing the decomposition, mostly these guys and their CN ratio, because of that ratio, most of the nitrogen is going to be immobilized from that decomposition. Remember what immobilization means? Basically, I'm taking a mineral form and turning it into an organic form. Okay? So the nitrogen that is in this plant material, greater than 20 to 1, the nitrogen that's in this plant material is basically being taken up by the organisms that are doing the decomposition. Okay? Now that ratio has to do with that, biomass, ATP, and waste. Good examples of this are something like a corn stover, where I have a high CN ratio, you plow it down, it gets into the soil. The nitrogen that's in that soil basically get immobilized. Okay? In fact, the organisms that are there, if the nitrogen isn't actually in the organic matter that they're decomposing, they'll take nitrogen from other sources, because this represents energy as well, and if they can get the energy and they can get nitrogen from another source, they'll take it. Okay? So as a result, we often have issues of nitrogen deficiency when we add high CN ratio material, because the organisms are much better than the plants at getting nitrogen. They can move around. So as a result, they'll start harvesting nitrogen from other sources because they're all about that biomass. Okay? Now, it turns out that this is usually a very temporary effect, but it depends upon the type of material that you're using. Okay? If I have a high CN ratio material that is really slow to decompose, like a wood chip type of material, the organic matter takes a while to decompose, so that nitrogen deficiency is attenuated. It's slowed up. It's not as dramatic. On the other hand, if it's a straw that decomposes very easily, that's when you're going to start seeing the nitrogen being taken from other sources, and as a result, you'll get that nitrogen deficiency. The reality is, though, that these nitrogen deficiencies are relatively short term, because what's going to happen to these organisms, they in turn are going to die, and when they die, they'll release the nitrogen again. Does that make sense? And what is their CN ratios? So basically, they've been concentrating the nitrogen, and when they die, they become a low CN ratio material, which leads us right into this next number. When the CN ratio is lower than 20, generally the nitrogen gets mineralized. It gets mobilized. It gets released. Okay? So if you're putting in material that has a low CN ratio, you're basically fertilizing your soils. It still has to decompose, but it's a quick fertilization compared to the slower fertilization that's associated with a 20 to 1. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? Questions about that? Go. Have they incorporated the time of nutrient release on this? So if we go back to like a slide like this, okay, yes, they have numbers that are associated with this. So if you take a look at this material, yes, it's going into biomass, but if it's a 10 to 1, this material is also releasing nutrients. And the timeline right there is 130 days. Okay. Now, have they quantified that? It depends on the type of material and the type of environment you are in, but yes. Okay, did everybody hear that question? Have they quantified, or do they have an idea about how much nitrogen is actually going to, or fertility is actually going to be released through decomposition? And they have, because basically what you can do is you can take a look at these numbers, and you know how much is going to biomass. You can predict how much is coming out as fertility. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be making it to the plants, but it does mean it's going to be released. Question?
You said the nitrogen will get immobilized with a high CN ratio for short term. What would you classify as short term?
Okay, so the question was the nitrogen, with a high CN ratio, the nitrogen is going to be immobilized for a short period of time. What in fact is that period of time? I do not have an answer for that one.
But in general.
So how long are we going to have this nitrogen deficiency issue? If it's in a garden, it's less than a season. If it's a lot of organic matter, it also is going to have to do with how much organic matter you add in, but it's not, there's often you'll see in these garden magazines that, the gray literature. Does anybody read garden magazines? It's another, I'm just the only geek that does that. Okay. There's a lot of literature out there that says, if you add woody chips to your soils, you have to fertilize because your plants are going to be hit because they're not going to have any nitrogen. Well, it's not necessarily true because it's usually a localized effect. Okay, so if I put woody chips up here, my localized nitrogen deficiency is not going to be all the way down here. It's just going to be very local. Okay, so and usually within the year, usually within the growing season, the plants are fine. Now that's not to say that the plants themselves aren't going to be mining for nitrogen as well. So that's not to say that if I put woody chips on the top, I don't have to fertilize. I mean, if I put wooden chips up here, I might actually be putting in some other types of organic matter that are going to decompose faster so they can provide nitrogen. Because when those plants are in there, they're going to be sucking up nutrients, nitrogen being one of them. Does that make sense to everybody?
So mulching shouldn't immobilize?
When you mulching should not immobilize at any kind of rate that is going to be problematic for plants. Now, when you start integrating that, and that mulch starts to decompose, and you start integrating, and you put more mulch in there, yeah, you're going to have those localized temporary nitrogen deficiencies. And they do exist. But if you're aware of them, you can manage for them. Okay, questions? We good with this? Go.
Doesn't it depend what CN ratio you keep in terms of what plants are growing?
Okay, so the question is, it doesn't matter what kind of plants that you have in location. And yeah, that's definitely the case. And it matters what kind of mulch you're using. I mean, I could put a allelopathic type up here too, but that has nothing to do with the CN ratio. It depends on what I'm using for my mulch. I mean, there's grass mulches, there's wood chip mulches, there's all different kinds of mulches, and it also depends on the type of plant. If I'm putting in, if they're young seedlings and things like that, that may be more problematic than a more established azalea or rhododendron or something like that. Does that make sense? If I'm putting in seeds into wood chips, one should expect you're going to have problems. On the other hand, if I'm putting in seedlings or something like that, less of a problem. It's where those plants are trying to harvest their nutrients, and if they're in that nitrogen deficiency zone, you should expect to see them having problems because the microbes are much better at getting it than they are. Question?
Like wood has a 130 to 400 carbon nitrogen ratio, so it would have a lot of nitrogen.
No, it would not have a lot of nitrogen. Have a lot of carbon to nitrogen. The first number is always carbon. So if this is 400, that's 400 carbon to 1 nitrogen.
Oh, I thought that was 130.
Yeah, sorry.
Does it matter how the organic matter is incorporated into the soil?
So the question was, does it matter how the organic matter is incorporated into the soil? And often it does, but that's a management decision. If you're putting all of your organic matter on the surface, that's going to be where the organic matter is going to be first reacting. If you integrate it in, it's a different matter. And so we often just put the organic matter on the top and let the organisms do the transportation. The worms will bring it down. As they decompose, the material gets decomposed, it gets smaller, and it will start moving down as well. The organisms themselves will move down there, and they are part of this biomass as well. But it's really an issue of what you're trying to grow and what you're trying to not necessarily grow, but what you're trying to do with that organic matter. Does that sort of answer that? I'm not sure it does, but okay. Any other questions on this one? Do we feel pretty comfortable with this? So I put this slide in here just sort of as a summary slide, and basically you have two different materials here. Up here is a high CN ratio, down here is a low CN ratio. And you've seen these graphs before. This is when I showed the CO2 evolution and decomposition. Okay, so this black line here, up here and here is basically the CO2 evolution. Okay, basically it represents the activity microbial community. Okay, it's their respiration. As it increases, the population is more active. Okay, and we usually associate that with a larger population. Okay, granted it could be one really large microbe, but okay. The green line that you see there, here, right here, and right here, that's the CN ratio of the material. So here it starts very high, here it starts fairly low. Okay? This green line that's underneath the green shade, that basically represents the amount of nitrogen that's released into the system. Okay? So as that nitrogen comes down, there's less nitrogen in the system. Now they're looking at nitrate, but nitrate is one form of nitrogen. Okay? As that line gets down, the available nitrogen in the system is depressed. As it goes up, the available nitrogen is increased, right? Okay, so if I start with a high CN ratio, fresh added material right here, you can see my population just boom, but you can also see my nitrate being depressed. Now this is the nitrate that's in the soil, not the nitrate that's in the nitrogen that's in the CN, not in the plant material that they're eating. Okay, so they're harvesting this nitrogen from someplace else, the soil. Okay, as time goes on, the population decreases, the CN ratio of the material also decreases, and somewhere down the line, that nitrogen that's in the soil, that's available nitrogen, starts to increase again. The populations are crashing. Okay, they're dying. They're releasing their nitrogen. On the other hand, low CN ratio material, population does the same bop, comes up, okay? But you can notice because the CN ratio is so low, the nitrogen is basically waste material in the carbon, in that food that they're eating. They don't need that much. But remember this, okay? If my CN ratio is too low, I have to be blowing off CO2, I have to be making ATP, all these other things, okay? I have waste material. And that waste material is represented in the increase of the nitrogen. It's just available. Now that's available to all the other organisms, the plants, that are in that system. Does that make sense to everybody? No? Yes? Questions? Cool.
Where's the
Oh.
original source of nitrogen?
The original source of nitrogen would have been someplace back here, some other organic matter that got added to the system. Now it also could be nitrogen fixation, but it's nitrogen that was added previously through organic matter amendments. Okay, so imagine I had a leaf fall back here. Okay, and then we're basically looking this at the next fall. Okay, in the next fall, I've got leaves going in. The leaves have a fairly low CN ratio compared to wood. Okay, this was a tree fall. This was a leaf fall. Okay, so this pool is starting at the same, basically the same spot because of the history of the site. Does that make sense, Lucas? Yeah. Okay. Go.
So the nitrate depression period, is that the nitrates in the rest of the soil that the microbes are actually feeding off of if they don't have enough?
That's the nitrate. So that's nitrate depression period. So that's this nitrate that came in prior to the food. This is with the soil. Okay, this is here already. This is not coming with the food stock. Okay, the food stock hits the ground. The organisms are going to start eating it. It's energy. But they don't have enough nutrients in that food stock. And so they're going to harvest other locations, which is going to be the nitrate that's in the soil.
So is that what you were talking about when you said like a nitrogen deficiency?
This would be a good example of a nitrogen deficiency. The microbe, so this is the example of nitrogen deficiency. If this nitrate pool is depressed because the microbes are getting it, and they are much better at getting it than everybody else is now going to have deficiency in nitrate. Does that make sense? Now, somewhere down the line, those organisms are going to start dying off. And once they start dying off, the CN ratios of the material that's being decomposed is going to start rising, or lowering, I should say. And as a result, nitrogen is going to be put into the soil, which then everybody else can get. Now, it should be noted that this is a very localized event. Where that food is where the decomposition is going to occur. It's not like they're going to go out to the Quickie Mart to get nitrogen. Okay? If the food is here, they're going to be depressed. The nitrogen is going to be being depressed in this zone. Okay? If the material is a high CN ratio material. If, on the other hand, the CN ratio of the material is actually fairly low, this is where the nitrogen is going to be released. It's going to be fairly localized. Okay? It's not going to, the nitrogen isn't going to start, well, it does actually migrate, but the nitrogen is not necessarily going to get over to the plant over there. It's going to be the plant that's over here that benefits from it. I.e., when you put in organic matter as fertilizer, you put your organic matter near where the organisms are that you want to take advantage of it. I don't put my compost over here and plant my corn over there and expect to get any response from it. Does that make sense? And that is actually a very good example of why location matters when you start talking about decomposition. Question?
So how does this work with nitrogen-fixing organisms?
How does this work with nitrogen-fixing organisms? So this is actually a really good example. In this type of environment, nitrogen-fixing organisms don't have an advantage. Nitrogen fixation. So the question is, how does this relate to nitrogen fixation? Microbes, there are a lot of organisms out there that have the ability to fix nitrogen. They take it from its mineral form and they immobilize it. They put it into a form that organisms can use. And we'll talk about this later in the semester as well. But to do that, it takes ATP. It takes energy. So if there's nitrogen that's readily available in the environment, this is no benefit to them whatsoever. Why should they waste energy if nitrogen is already there? Make sense? On the other hand, in a scenario like this, where nitrogen is in competition, they can basically take nitrogen gas from the atmosphere and fix it into a biologically usable form. That's a severe advantage, a significant, not a severe, well, it is severe, a severe advantage in this type of environment. Because there are a lot of organisms that can't fix nitrogen. And if you are an organism that can fix it, can take it out of the atmosphere and put it into a biomass form, you have a severe advantage. These guys, most of these guys are taking the nitrogen that's in here is already in an organic form. It's in a form that organisms can use. But if I get rid of that, there's nothing there for them to use. So in that case, those organisms that have the ability to take N2 out of the atmosphere and turn it into an ammonium form, an amine form, that's a huge advantage. Now, we really are going to be talking about nitrogen later in the semester, but does everybody have an idea about what I mean when I say they're fixing nitrogen? Sort of, ish? I'm uncomfortable with the nodding that I'm getting here. So let me show you. We'll do this real quick, and we'll talk about it later, a lot later in the semester. The nitrogen cycle we're not going to talk about right now, but there's basically, for lack of a better, there's basically two forms of nitrogen that organisms can use, and they'll convert it into amines. And the amine is basically a form that's like this. Okay, and it's attached to a carbon structure, it's part of the body. Okay, but they're doing it. They're basically taking these two forms. Now, not all organisms have the ability to take each one of these forms, but plants do have the ability to take either one of these forms. Okay, this is the nitrogen that's being released through decomposition, and it's coming out in these forms, which plants can then take up. But there is an abundance of this in the atmosphere. What is it, 80%, 79%? Whatever. There's this huge number of nitrogen in the atmosphere, except it's in an unavailable form. The plants can't take it up. But there are organisms that can basically convert this nitrogen into these forms for use. Actually, they've converted it into this form for use. Now, most of them are in symbiotic relationships with plants, where the plants are giving them carbon or energy, and the microorganisms that are doing the fixing are giving the plants the nitrogen. Okay? But if this is the nitrogen that is not available here, there is an abundance of this nitrogen, N2 gas, in this environment, even when the nitrate is depressed. So as a result, the organisms that can do that, they'll do this, and they'll survive. The organisms that can't do that and aren't as good as the microbes at getting this, they're basically going to go into senescence and potentially die. Does that make sense? Questions? Go.
I think I understand this concept, but why do some of the bacteria or microorganisms prefer legumes as opposed to corn?
I don't know if it's that they prefer it, but the relationship for nitrogen fixation has developed in the legumes while it hasn't developed in the corn. The symbiotic relationship between the microbial population and the corn has never been developed. On the other hand, Got a good analogy here. Good analogy. I can't think of a good analogy for this. It's like pizza and beer. It goes really well together. Beer and cake doesn't go that well together. That's a really terrible one. The microbial population that has the ability to fix nitrogen. Some of them live by themselves, but some of these guys have developed relationships with certain plants, and corn happens not to be one of those plants. There's a whole slew of different types of plants. It's not just legumes. There's some trees and some other organisms, and there's also some fungi type of relationships as well. But corn just happens not to be one of them. My good case for GMOs. I knew you were going to go there. We were just talking about GMOs earlier, but this is not. We're not going to go that direction. Okay, I think question. But does that make sense to you? Kind of.
Yeah, but I guess
Yeah, but
why I still don't understand.
the beer and pizza one, that makes sense, right? Okay. Any other questions on this one? We're fairly good with this. All right. Now, I want to make an addendum here, and I think I've already actually made this addendum. The reality is that this is not living in isolation, okay? The CN ratio is not, we've portrayed it sort of as it's like by itself, it's individual control, but the reality is that if this is my population of organisms, here, this is a good one. I'm not sure I've got the right numbers, but if E. coli, you guys know what E. coli is? Microorganism. It's a gut organism, but it's everywhere else. Okay, if E. coli were left to their own devices and nothing ate them and they never died, because of their ability to replicate themselves I think within a week or something like that, some really unbelievably small time, within a week, the entire solar system would be occupied by E. coli. Something like that. Maybe it's a month or something, but it's really this small number. So that gives you an idea about how the lifespan of these E. coli, if they were immortal, okay? But the reality is they're not immortal, and most of the time, of course they die of old age, but most of the time they're being eaten by something, because everything's a food for something, right? Okay, so if we look at this, here's that fresh, you've seen this one before, okay, here's that fresh material that's been added. This is the CO2 evolution, basically looking at the population, okay, but that population drops, right? So what's happening in that population? Okay, that population is doing the decomposition of the CN material, right? Okay, but if we actually look at the amount of nitrogen that's being released from the soil that's being decomposed, or no. I add fresh material, and I just have microbes in it. Okay, they're going to produce a certain amount of biomass, and they're going to release a certain amount of nitrogen. They're going to mineralize a certain amount of nitrogen. Okay, and that's what these lines basically represent here. This is mineral nitrogen that's in the soil over periods of days. Okay, this dark line right here is with nematodes. This dashed line right here is with no nematodes. Okay, and you'll note that without the nematodes, there's a lot less release of nitrogen into the soil system. Okay, so if I did not have nematodes, this is how much nitrogen would be released in the system. With nematodes, this is what's being released. Now, nematodes are sort of predatory little worms type things. And basically what they're doing is they're eating this population. And in the process of doing the eating, they're breaking them up, and they're sloppy eaters just like us. And that nitrogen that's in the biomass of the microbial population is being released. So it's not simply a relationship of the decomposers and their waste products. It also has to do with the whole trophic structure of the soil has a huge influence on how much nitrogen is actually released. And the take-home message of the slide is don't just look at CN ratios. You also have to look at other things. Okay, placement being one of them. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, questions so far? Cool? All right, we're going to take the last section, and that's basically litter quality. And the truth is that CN is part of litter quality, okay? But we pull it apart because it's an important feature by itself. Okay, so litter quality. Okay, here's those CN ratios up at the top. CN ratio greater than 20, I'm having N immobilization. CN ratios less than 20, I'm going to have nitrogen release. mineralization, right? Make sense? Okay, well, let's take a look at CN ratios of a variety of different materials. Okay, the rule of thumb is high CN ratio is going to mean that I'm going to have N immobilization. Low CN ratio, I'm going to have N release. But just because I look at those numbers, I also need to look at the structure of the material that's being decomposed. Okay, this stuff up here, these are low CN ratio stuff. This is high CN ratio. This is time on this track, and 0 here represents the point at which above I'm seeing mineralization, below I'm seeing immobilization. Below immobilization meaning it's going into the biomass. It's being taken out of the system. Mineralization meaning the nitrogen is being released into the system for everybody else. Okay? Now I have 4 different materials here. This is straight out of your book. I have a low lignin and phenolic materials, low CN ratio. I have high lignin and or polyphenolic materials with a low CN ratio. I have high lignin and low lignin with a high CN ratio and a high CN ratio. Okay? Look at these green lines, and they basically, this is time, so the quicker it moves up, the faster it happens, okay? And the distance here is basically representing how much mineralization or immobilization occurs. So just because you have a low CN ratio doesn't necessarily mean, this is the class of these 2 lines here are what we generally would think of, okay? This is low lignins. This is low lignins as well. Lignin content, the ability of the material, basically represents, or the structure of that material, basically that represents how fast it in fact can be decayed. Okay, so if I have I don't know if I still have this. Did I keep this? Remember this slide? So if we think about the material and how fast it decomposes, in general, this is not necessarily true. In general, we think of the glucoses being simple sugars. They're going to be easy to decompose. The lignins being very complex molecules, being very hard to decompose. Okay? Now, go back to this slide. Low lignin on the outside, fast to decompose. The inner 2 have high lignin contents, and so as a result, they take longer to decompose. Yes, they both have the same CN ratio as these guys, and they, in general, end up at the same point, but it just takes a different time scale for them to get to that point. Does that make sense? Yeah? Now, if we look at a lot of different materials, I don't know if, can you guys actually see this slide? It's in the PDF that you guys have. But basically what you're looking at here is a variety of different plants, okay, and it tells you what the plant parts are. But what it shows here is lignin versus polyphenol content. So higher numbers, this one has a really high number, has a fairly high number of polyphenol, and basically it shows you the CN ratios. Okay, this is lignin. Its CN ratio is 28:1. This has a very small amount of lignin, basically 7%. It has a ratio of 43:1. Okay? Now, this is this constant is a decomposition constant. Okay? The higher the number, the quicker it decomposes. Okay? So, looking here at this 13:1 material, it decomposes very quickly. But these 43 and 42:1s compared to the 28, these guys decompose a lot quicker than this. So it's not the CN ratio alone, it's the structure of the material. Does that make sense? So in essence, this is the data that filled in this chart. Okay? Now, we've talked a lot about placement, CN ratios, size, litter quality. What is it, if we're looking at decomposition, what is it that actually is, when you look at everything together, what is it that's controlling those rates? It really is the property of the organic material, where it happens to be, the CN ratio of it, the surface area of it, and its resistance to decay. Now the truth is that all of these combined, it really is where it is located. It's location, location, location. But it's this combination of different things that controls its decomposition.